I'm Tony, and if we haven't met yet, I'm the new lead pastor here at 242. And I've enjoyed spending the last few months getting to know the church and many of you. We're so glad you've been watching 242 at home. When we created this special service, our desire was to make our church services easier during a season where gathering was difficult and sometimes just not possible. The 242 at-home services mirrored our live services, but with pre-recorded messages and a shorter worship time. We soon came to realize that with a separate service, you may feel a bit, separate. We don't want that. We want you to know that we're here for you live and in person. See, every week we're seeing more and more people attend our local campuses, which is exciting. And when you can't attend in person, maybe you're sick, quarantining, maybe you're on vacation, we want to invite you to peek inside one of our live services. We stream the service from our Brighton campus live each week, and it will be available on demand immediately after the service. When you're able, we hope you can join us in person. We want to support you on your faith journey. We want to be here for you and help you take next steps with God. And you can help others. Inviting someone to attend church with you may be the right first step for someone else on their path to meeting God. This is really important as we approach Christmas. There are so many people looking for connections and comfort during the holidays. At Christmas time, more than ever, people are open to hearing about the baby born in a manger who grew up to be the Savior of the world. So this current message series called Above Anxiety will be our last at-home video series. Starting December 5th, we invite you to join us in person or watch the live services online. If you live far from one of our campuses, we would love to connect with you and help you find a great church in your area. Just go to 242community.com/next to connect with a pastor. We really hope to see you soon.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. My name's John. This is Caroline. We are worship leaders here at 242, and we're just so glad that you have taken time out of your day and your schedule to spend with us worshiping God. Whether you sing this song or whether you just listen as we sing, I pray that this song blesses you and draws you closer to Jesus' heart. Let's sing. I've been stained black and blue from all this dirt I've been through. Now your love's reaching out to make me new. It's you, it's you. Take my hands and wash me. Hear my voice, I'm coming clean. Cleanse my lips and I'll sing. It's you, it's you. I've been drawn to my knees. I've been lost and friend, you've searched for me. And you've been with me and you'll see me through. It's you, it's you. Take my hands and wash me. Hear my voice, I'm coming clean. Cleanse my lips and I'll sing. It's you, it's you. 'Cause you drown my sorrows deep in this love you've given free. You drown my sorrows this love you've given free. Yeah, you drown my sorrows deep in this love you've given free. Yeah, you drown my sorrows deep in this love you've given free. Yeah. When I turn from this earth, reach the gates in rebirth, I'll see your face and I'll softly say, it's you, it's you. Take my hands. So take my hands and wash me. Hear my voice, I'm coming clean. Cleanse my lips and I'll sing. It's you, it's you. Oh, take my hands and wash me. Hear my voice, I'm coming clean. Oh, cleanse my lips and I'll sing. It's you, it's you. It's you, it's you. It's you, it's you.
All right, well, greetings 242. It's just a real treat to be with you. My name's Steve, and I know that you guys have been in this incredible series called Above Anxiety for several weeks. Just a couple of things before we get going. I have considered myself a friend of this church for over a decade. It was about 10 years ago where I first learned about 242 and really the incredible outreach and what you do in the community, the innovation of this church. And also, just to let you in on a little secret, I have a number of friends inside this church. So it's just a real honor for me to come and join you today as you tackle what's a fantastic topic and what can at first be like a threatening topic, but once you get into it, you really discover that there's tremendous freedom as we look at this thing called anxiety. I also want those of you who are not followers of Christ to know something, that you are equally welcome in this church. It may sound strange coming from a guest as well, that a guest would come and say maybe to you who might also be a guest, maybe you're not sure what you believe. Maybe your faith is rusty. You were raised in something and then you put it down for a while and now you're picking it up again and trying to make sense of it. I just want you to know that in many ways was my journey. I did not grow up in the church. And what I discovered in my own spiritual quest, that not only is there a God, but that there's a God who loves us very particularly. And so you're equally welcome here as well. You know, in the first week of this series, I really love how Tony put it, where he said that, all humans carry anxiety, and it's not so much something to graduate from or to overcome. It's really something to get on top of. And I think probably most of us have experienced what it's like when you're under anxiety. That feeling of doom, that feeling where everything's really on your shoulders, where suddenly you start to feel like you have to figure something out. One of the unique aspects, particularly of chronic anxiety, which is the kind of anxiety we're tackling here, is that it actually tries to convince you, like chronic anxiety, it's kind of like a spiritual force. It tries to convince you that God's not with you. And you suddenly feel this impending doom, that it's on your shoulders, that you should bear down, you should try harder. Many of us try to kind of worry our way through anxiety. But there's another way. There's another way, and that's the way I'd like to share with us today. My own journey, if I look back 25 years when I first started this journey, if you'd asked me as a 24-year-old if I'm an anxious person, I would have said absolutely not. Like, I just wouldn't see myself that way because I didn't see myself as somebody who worried about much. I was a pretty carefree fellow. I also was not naturally a fearful person. Some people who are more fearful than others. And therefore, I would have said I was not an anxious person. What I didn't know at the time is that my certainty, my confidence, my feeling of invincibility, it was kind of a thin veneer that covered what was really a fairly deep insecurity and quite a lot of pain. And so my own journey started when I was 24 years of age, and I served as a trauma chaplain and a hospice chaplain in a hospital. And I'd never seen a dead body before. I'd never had any experience with grief before. And next thing I know, I've got all of these hospital beepers on my belt, and I'm running into rooms where somebody has died, or I'm having to tell somebody that they're dying. And suddenly I came face to face with this, well, I guess I just call it this thing under the surface of my life that kept erupting like a volcano. I know what to call it now. It's chronic anxiety. At the time, it was just something I didn't even know was there. I remember 6 weeks into being a chaplain and the emergency room beeper going off. And almost instinctually, without even thinking about it, I prayed a prayer to God as I rushed down to the ER to meet that poor family. I remember the prayer praying, please God, don't let it be my wife. My biggest fear as a chaplain was that somebody I dearly loved would be coming through on that gurney, with their head strapped to the gurney and their eyes all worried, and there I would be. And I'd already been married 7 weeks at that point. And then I remember when I got to the gurney and it wasn't my wife and it wasn't anybody I knew, then I would pray a second prayer, thank you, God, that is not my wife. And it took me a while to realize that there was this whole side of me under the surface that if I didn't do something about it, it would fester. And I had this choice. I had this fork in the road. Am I going to look into this thing that I didn't know existed? These fears that were bubbling, these assumptions, these expectations. Because sometimes what happens, the power of trauma chaplaincy, the power of hospice chaplaincy, is it put me in the throes of death and grief multiple times a day. And there's nothing quite like death and grief to really get you to the end of yourself. And that's when you have to figure out what's going on under the surface. And in a lot of ways, the series that 242's been in is just taking a little bit of a deeper dive under the surface to figure out what's going on. And so for the last 25 years, as I looked at those fears, as I looked at my need to explain things when I don't know the answer, as I looked at this chronic need that I have to please people, if I'm ever in a meeting and I think someone's disappointed with me and I get that reactive feeling, a 25-year journey for me, and I got to admit, it's been quite a battle. You'd think this kind of thing comes naturally, but it actually takes practice and precision. So what I want to do today for us is just give us two very simple tools. Actually, they're quite precise tools on how we can go from being managed by anxiety to managing it. I flew in from Colorado. I'm obviously not from around these parts. I was born in Perth, Western Australia. But I live in Colorado in the Denver area. And I moved into Colorado in 2005. And it was right around 2006 that I realized that it's a sin not to fly fish in Colorado. I was not a fly fisherman at that point, but Colorado is such a spectacular part of the world. I'm very sorry for those of you living in Michigan, as here I talk about this magical place called Colorado, but it really is magical. I live about an hour from some of the world's finest fly fishing streams, and so I took up the craft of fly fishing in 2006. And I discovered very quickly that even though as an Aussie kid I'd grown up fishing all my life, I was really bad at it. I was really bad at fly fishing. I've never had a hobby in my life before that I've put so much time and money into that I'm so terrible at. It's quite an obsessive thing. You have to be an entomologist. You have to know more about bugs than even like a biologist. You have to have a weird relationship with craft fabric. You find yourself as a red-blooded man in Hobby Lobby way more than I think any of us would be comfortable admitting. But what fly fishing is really about is the ability to cast. If you can see a trout in the stream and you can accurately get the fly about 18 inches above the trout's nose to set it so it'll just drift right and just bump that fly off the trout's lips, you are more likely to catch a fish than not. An accurate cast will catch a fish. A sloppy cast never will. So I just want to talk to us just for a few minutes about casting. Because it turns out in the Bible, people cast things in the Bible, and also God casts things. Let's take a look at people casting things. 1 Peter 5, 7 and 8. Peter writes, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." He goes on to say, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings." So here's this command right out of the gate from Peter, where Peter tells us to cast. He says, cast all your anxieties on him, that is God, of course, because he cares for you. What I find fascinating is how Peter, it's almost like he changes the subject, but he's not changing the subject, where he then goes on to say, be alert. My mother, she used to say, be alert because the world needs more alerts. That says a lot about my mum more than anything else, really, come to think of it. But be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Peter describes in this passage the devil as a predator. It might be that you're not a follower of Christ and maybe you're a guest today, and here you have a preacher talking about the devil and you're thinking, you've got to be kidding, right? Like this is the 21st century, like we have iPads and Wi-Fi and coffee shops. We still really believe like in a devil? It's interesting, isn't it? But that is what followers of Christ believe. We believe that there is a spiritual dark force and it's personified, and it explains why so much terrible things happen. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that anxiety is necessarily from the devil, but what I'm interested in looking at is the way that anxiety has some of those same predatory traits the way Peter describes the devil has. If you look back at this passage, anxiety prowls around. Anxiety looks to devour. It gets a hold of you before you know it. How many times have you found yourself not anxious, but really, really anxious before you even realized it? It's like you went from 0 to 60 before you even knew you were anxious. I know, I think it was Brad that was mentioning in your series where he was talking about if you're not sure what makes you anxious, just bravely ask somebody who loves you, and they will happily tell you the kinds of things that make you anxious that you don't know make you anxious. That's the thing about anxiety. If you don't get on top of it, if you don't get above it, it kind of consumes you. Or I guess I could say in the words of Peter, if you don't cast it, if you don't intentionally cast it away, it doesn't go anywhere. How many of you have ever tried to worry your way to peace? Like, you just get to ruminating on something and you can't shake it. You're just thinking and thinking and thinking because you believe the lie that if you just worry enough, you'll finally get to peace. That's not how anxiety works. Anxiety is much more like drinking salt water. Anxiety is much more like being on a treadmill where you're running and running and running. You're not getting anywhere. Not only that, but while you're on the treadmill, anxiety walks over and he starts pushing the go faster button and the steep incline button. Anxiety will get a hold of you and it will devour you unless you learn to cast it. So let's just talk about some accurate casting techniques. First of all, if you can name it, you can tame it. If you can name it, you can tame it. So one of the most powerful things that you can do when you notice that you're getting anxious, and if you go back in this series, Tony and Brad both have given us a number of tools to learn how to notice we're anxious when we look at our physiology, for example, our spinning mind, our racing heart, our tightening body. Once you notice that you're anxious, the next thing to do is it's the simplest thing and it's the most difficult thing. It's simple, it's not complicated. I'm not saying it's easy, I'm saying it's simple. It's simple, but it's also the most difficult thing because anxiety keeps us so wrapped up. If you can learn to notice that you're anxious, the next thing to do is to simply pause. Just pause. Just make the intentional move to get off that treadmill and name it to tame it. Another way to say it, I love the way Dr. Henry Cloud mentioned it. He says, learn to think about the way you think. Think about the way you think. And if you can name it, you can tame it. So learning to know what generates anxiety for you can really help in your casting accuracy. I've been studying chronic anxiety for 25 years in a field of study called systems theory. As Tony mentioned in week 1, there's all kinds of anxieties. There's grief, there's acute anxiety, there's trauma. The field that we're really talking about today is what's known as chronic anxiety. And chronic anxiety is generated by false belief and false assumptions. Sometimes the reason you get anxious is because you have an assumption about yourself that isn't necessarily true, and you're operating out of that false assumption, the way you believe you must be in order for things to be okay. Sometimes the reason you get anxious is because anxiety is contagious and somebody has placed a false assumption on you. We just wrapped up Thanksgiving. So Thursday, some of you were gathered around a table of family that is nothing more than less than false assumption and false expectation. And the turkey may have been delicious, but you may or may not, but you may have come away from that Thanksgiving table carrying some anxiety, carrying some reactivity. If you can learn to notice what generates your false assumptions and your false beliefs, you can begin to flip the power dynamic. And as I've studied chronic anxiety all these years, I've come to see that there are 5 core generators of chronic anxiety. So I'm going to list the 5, they'll also be on the screen. And let's see if you can find yourself in any of these 5. Now, if it happens that you find yourself in all of these 5, don't worry, there's nothing wrong with you. You don't have to tunnel out of here or anything. That's quite normal. Most of us have at least some of these 5. I personally have 3 of them. Here they are. The 5 big generators of anxiety is control, perfection, knowing the answer, being there for people, and approval from others. Control, right? Does that need explanation? Some of you get very anxious when you're not in control. You often need to have the last word. Maybe you're in a team meeting and everyone votes, but somehow your vote gets the most weight and people end up doing what you want to do. Why is that? Is it because of your incredible charisma and good looks? No, it's because you're a control freak, and everyone has understood that. When you don't get control, you get extremely anxious. Perfectionists. This is those of you who you believe that you have to get it perfectly right the first time, every time, even though you've never done it before. You're raging perfectionists. Another sign that perfection is it for you is that you just simply are not able to celebrate when you do something well. You have to look at how you could have done it better, and you think that's a positive trait. The third one, knowing the answer, always knowing the answer. This is one of mine. It's very difficult for me to be in a meeting where somebody asks someone else a question. They don't even have to ask me a question. They can ask someone else the question, and I believe the lie that I should answer it. We have children. We have a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 14-year-old. They all have smartphones. They've all basically got the world's knowledge in their pocket. But when they don't know something, do they pull out their phone and Google it? No. They come over and ask Dad. And then when Dad doesn't know, do I encourage them to Google it? No. They stand there while I pull out my phone and I Google it for them. What is that? That's crazy. That's because my anxiety of needing to know the answer has set up a recurring pattern of behavior in my family that when people don't know something, they come to Dad because I like to know the answer. And when I don't know something, I get filled with reactivity, with chronic anxiety. I would say this one here, knowing the answer, this was one of the biggest lessons I had to learn as a chaplain, is how do you help somebody who is facing death or somebody in grief when you are so accustomed to shrinking their problem down to a pithy answer? How do you manage that rising desire to say something when there's nothing to say? The fourth one, being there for people. For some of you, it's so difficult when you know that someone's hurting and you want to rush to their aid. Some of you even, you're so driven to be there for people, they didn't even ask you to help and you're helping them. You may have even found yourself offending a friend because you're being overly helpful. Or maybe for you, you give and you give and you give and you're always there for people, you're always there, and then at some point you feel this, that you've been taken advantage of, that no one appreciates that all you're doing. That's because you're driven by this anxiety to always be there for people. And of course, the fifth one, approval from others. That's another one for me as well. My three would be knowing the answer, being there for people, approval from others. If I ever feel like someone's disappointed in me or they don't like me, I'm a lead pastor. Sometimes this might shock you as a church, but sometimes people send critical emails to lead pastors. And I get those critical emails and there's this thing in me, that suddenly bubbles up like lava erupting from a volcano, and I get anxious. Which one's for you? Where do you find yourself on these five? If you can find yourself on them, now you can get power over them. Now, just a quick thing, because we are going to move pretty quickly today. I just want to say, some of you right now, rather than doing your own work, you're thinking of somebody. You're saying, oh, I wish Jim was here. I'm going to send this message to Jim. Don't send this message to Jim. It does not work to prescribe this work for other people. This is for you and God to do for yourself. Where do you find yourself on the five? Now, as you look at these characteristics, there's something unique about all five. Always in control, always doing it perfectly, always knowing everything, always being there for people and giving us our approval. These are the five characteristics of God. This is what makes God, God, and us not. Genesis chapter 3, when the tempter, when the accuser went to Adam and Eve, he offered them the very first temptation ever faced to human beings. He said to them, you can be like God. You can be like God. So the theology behind chronic anxiety is that the big five generators are also the character traits of God. And when we try to be like God, we get anxious. So one of the ways that you can accurately cast your anxiety is figure out which of the five am I being driven by right now? Which of these false needs do I believe I need that I don't really need? And how can I let the gospel displace them so that I can do exactly what God actually requires rather than what I'm requiring of myself? What God actually requires out of God's followers is to be exactly human-sized. That's all God's ever expected out of you and I. When God made human beings, God knew exactly what God was doing. God was not surprised at all that we're exactly human-sized. But anytime we try to supersize ourselves, we try to always be in control, we try to always have the answer and so on, we end up getting filled with anxiety. Now, For those of you who'd like a little extra work, a little harder work, and you want maybe a power tool to flip the power dynamic, to really get on top of your anxiety, really get above your anxiety, here's what you can do, is once you've figured out where you are in the 5, is just get in the habit this month of bravely practicing the opposite. Just set your calendar for, like 6 times, and bravely do the opposite of the thing that you think you need. So if you're a control freak, put yourself in 6 situations this month where you're out of control. Now, I'm not talking about jumping off a cliff and doing something dangerous, just out of control. Those of you who are perfectionists, make 6 mistakes this month in front of people. In front of people. It helps to do it in front of people. Again, don't make such a whopper mistake that you end up in jail. Like that's too much. But just find 6 mistakes you can make. Those of you who always need to know the answer, get in the habit of being in a meeting where you simply say, I don't know. I don't know. Even when you do know, by the way. Even when you heard it right here from a pastor, God gives you 3 lies a year before counting it against you. So even when you know, just you can say, I don't know. Those of you who always incessantly must be there for people, you have to let 6 people down this month. Somebody calls and says, hey, can you help me move? And you can, and you've got the time, you have to lie and say, I'm sorry, I can't help. And those of you who must have the approval of others to be okay. Meeting with somebody and being unimpressive. Meeting with somebody who doesn't like you and not trying to convince them to like you with your humor or your extra content or whatever it is. All that God ever required from us is exactly human-sized followers. And that is one of the ways that we begin to relax into the grace of God, is when we realize that God is God and we are not. And that's why we worship God. Those of us who are followers of Christ, that's why we've given our whole life to worship God, because God is the one that can carry all this and we can release it. And what anxiety tells us to do is try harder. That's one of the false messages of anxiety, try harder. But you'll get further by dying than by trying. If this week you start to notice this kind of lava erupting up like a volcano, you can pause. You can start to locate your anxiety. You can start to name a source. And then you can die to your need to have it rather than try harder. The second tool, this is less of a diagnostic tool. This is more of just a fun displacement tool, is what you can do this week is just set an hour, maybe you do it right after church, set an hour and make a list. Make specifically what I call a life-giving list. And it's the simplest thing. Simply make a list of the people, the places, and the activities that make you feel like a kid in God's kingdom, that make you feel carefree, make you feel whimsical. The people, the places, and the activities. Now, there's 2 ways you can make a list. You can just open up a journal or grab a piece of paper. But also, I've got a very simple, free, downloadable spreadsheet that you can make. So there's the QR scan on the screen. We'll leave this up for a while if you'd like to just download your own life-giving list. It's the list of the people and the places and the activities that make you feel like a kid in the kingdom. Sometimes the way you can overcome your anxiety is by diagnosing it. That's what we've been talking about so far. But sometimes the way to do it is to displace it. To displace it. And the life-giving list is one of the most powerful tools that I use to displace my chronic anxiety. I've been using a life-giving list for about 1.5 years now, maybe a couple of years. And just to give you some context, I have 136 items on my list. Just those of you who are competitive. Why don't you set your stopwatch for like 30 minutes and see if you can come up with 30 things. People, you don't need that explained. There are people in your life that the only reason you love them is because Jesus commanded it. Don't put those people on your list. But there are people in your life that are a gift from God to you, that every time you're around them, you just feel lighter, you feel better. make a note. Places. The places should be anywhere inside your house to somewhere you have to get on a plane for. Like a wide range of places. Places in your house, places you can walk to, places you can drive to, places you have to get on a plane to. So I, for example, have the chair where I read my Bible on my list, and I have a CC Italy on my list. I've been there one time in my life. I don't know if I'll ever get back there, but it was life-giving. It's on the list. Activities should be anything that take just a few minutes and are free of charge to anything that takes several days and you have to budget money for. Micro and macro. Now, the reason I'm encouraging you to get so detailed on this list is because chronic anxiety, it bears you down. It keeps your head down and you lose your imagination. Chronic anxiety actually makes your thinking rigid, to where you can no longer use your imagination. If you've already done your homework of a life-giving list, you don't have to wonder what you can do. You can just pull out your list. Some things on my list. 1 square of Lindt chocolate. I let it melt in my mouth very slowly. 1 square is life living. A whole package, that's binge eating. That's a whole other sermon. Holding my wife for a minute or longer. I'm not going to get explicit with you in this message, but there's something about extended physical touch. Go ahead, just right where you're sitting. Just grab the person next to you, even if you don't know them, and just ask if they'd hold you for, I'm just kidding, I wouldn't ever make you do that. Rubbing my dog's floppy ears is on my life-giving list. 5 minutes of playing acoustic guitar. Going for a drive in the mountains. You can start to see the range of things that are on the list. Maybe this week is the week to schedule making the list and doing some things on the list. And just finally, as we close, we're not the only ones that cast something in the Bible. God is the master caster. 1 John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Here's what we know about chronic anxiety clinically. Chronic anxiety cannot stay in the same space as love and laughter. One displaces the other. When you're filled with chronic anxiety, you're no longer aware of the love of God. That's actually one of the signals where you can start to notice you've stopped noticing that God's with you. Chronic anxiety displaces your awareness of love, but in the same way, becoming and encountering the love of God displaces your chronic anxiety. Perfect love casts out fear. I love the way that the psalmist wrote it. David wrote it in Psalm 103, where he says, as far as the east is from the west, so far has he cast our transgressions from us. Just the simple idea that God casts our sin and our condemnation, and it's still traveling. You know, sometimes when you think of casting, you do think of that fishing where it lands, but when God casts, he flings it on a trajectory, and it's just moving further and further and further away. If you listen to the voice of chronic anxiety, it is the voice of condemnation. If you listen to the voice of God, it is the voice of acceptance and love. And so you have a choice today. Which one do you want to stay in? Which one do you want to dig around in? Every one of us has the capacity to notice when we're getting filled with anxiety, and rather than keep on going, just to pause and to reflect and to think about the way we think and to try to understand what false belief has gotten a hold of me and what's the truth of the gospel. And when we enter into that truth, we can actually experience the peace and freedom that Jesus promises in his word. So casting today, what has God called you to cast? And what is God casting in your life? Just as we close, I'm going to invite you to pray. And I'm just going to invite us to pray in a time of silence. If it helps, just take everything out of your hands. And just you can have your hands in a palm up posture, or it might help if you have them on your lap. And let me just prompt us with some silence, and then I'll close. Just this first prayer, while our hands are in an open posture. If there's something that you're clutching, something that you're grasping onto, or something that has a hold of you that you know God is calling you to trust God with, you can just tell God that in silence now. And just while we're in the silence, if there's something that you need from God today, while your hands are in a receiving posture, you can ask God for that now. Father, thank you that you invite us to cast our cares on you. It's not a passive thing, it's work, and it's hard work. And Lord, you know, it's hard for us to realize when we're anxious. But thank you, Lord, that every time we cast our cares upon you, you take them. And thank you that you cast our anxiety far from us, that perfect love displaces fear. Thank you that you're the God of all comfort. Thank you that the peace of Christ can flood our souls. Lord, thank you that you're the one that gives us the peace and freedom that comes with being in your truth. We thank you in Jesus' name.